Who are your top 5 South Asian figures that schools should cover in the national curriculum?
Choosing my top 5 South Asian figures to include in the curriculum was really, really difficult. What I've tried to do is to sort of, I guess it links with what we were just talking about. It's this idea of not adding on or bolting on to your curriculum, but blending these stories within the context that you already teach. So first of all, I think if we're thinking about South Asian figures, I think it's so important that students don't just see South Asian figures within the context of Britain. So not just, so basically, so making sure that students understand the existence of India before Britain got there, because believe it or not, India had a really rich, diverse history before that. And I teach Mughal India at my school, and I remember when we first started teaching it, which was probably about 8 or 9 years ago, there was not one textbook about it at all. And I knew nothing about Mughal India, absolutely nothing. So myself and the rest of my department, we researched all the different emperors, etc. And it is so fascinating. There is so much family drama. There's so many just brilliant stories. And so I think that if you are going to be teaching about South Asian history in schools, I think the Mughals are a fantastic context to teach the students about. In terms of a particular figure, I thought about who the favourite person is that my students like to be taught about, and it's probably Akbar the Great, who was one of the Mughal emperors. He was sort of most famous for the fact that he was Muslim, as all the Mughals were, but he did so much to sort of bridge the divide between Hindus and Muslims within India. And there's been sort of films about him as well and things like that. So he's really sort of iconic within Indian history. And the kids love watching clips from Bollywood films about him as well. So I think that, I think you should start, I think definitely the Mughals need to be part of that story, because I think it's important for students to see South Asian history not just through the lens of the empire. So I guess the Mughals are a group of people. Akbar could be the person there specifically. The second person that I chose, we had another question about freedom fighters as well within India. So I wanted to suggest somebody who is a freedom fighter for Indian independence who is not Gandhi. Because I think that's really, really important. So one of my favourite people within the Indian independence movement is a lady called Sarojini Naidu. So she's not very well known, even though she is absolutely amazing. So she was the first woman to be the president of the International Congress, who were the party who eventually led an independent India. She was really vocal about women's rights as well. She lobbied the British government after women got the vote in Britain. She lobbied the British government to give women the vote in India. As well, she would go around the country and lecture women about empowerment, and she was imprisoned several times as well for her protests. I think it's really interesting because she played a big part in the Indian independence movement, and played a big role in the Salt March. And obviously the Salt March is this really iconic protest of Gandhi, and it's really interesting that if you Google the Salt March, there are photos of Gandhi standing next to her on the Salt March, yet her story seems to have been sort of just erased from our understanding of the Indian independence movement. So I think at primary level, kids learn about Gandhi, at Key Stage 3 they do as well. Why not also tell them about this woman and show them the photo of both of them standing together? And because I just think she's just an incredible person to learn about. My third group of people, I'm not going to talk too much about it because I know it's going to come up later, but you have to talk about the contribution that the South Asian people had in World War I and World War II, because the role that people from South Asia played is hugely, hugely important to the victory that Britain enjoyed. So if I had to pick one person, I would pick Noor Inayat Khan. So I posted about her on the History Corridor this week. So Noor Inayat Khan was a spy. She grew up in Paris, but she actually moved to Britain after things that were happening in Europe. And she trained as a wireless operator. So she basically was the person who spies in Europe would have to kind of communicate with her about where they were and things like that. So she was parachuted into Nazi-occupied France, which first of all is just incredible. I think we'll all agree. And she was a wireless operator. It's really interesting actually because the life expectancy of a wireless operator at that time was 6 weeks. So she went into that job knowing that she was unlikely to survive, I suppose. Unfortunately, she was captured by the Nazis. She was imprisoned for several months, obviously must have undergone torture, etc., by the Nazis to reveal information. She never did. and she was executed by the Nazis at Dachau concentration camp, which I've been to actually, and there's a plaque there for her that commemorates her death. And I think she's so important because she's known as the first British Muslim war hero, and yet not a lot of people know about her. And
I've never heard of her. I feel really bad.
She's just incredible. She's absolutely incredible. There's a bust of her in Gordon Square in Bloomsbury. So after I taught the first lesson that I did about her, I laid some flowers at the memorial for her that I wrote a note from my class to her, and she's just incredible. So I think that she's a great story because she's really important to the context of World War II, and every school teaches about World War II. So therefore, why not include her story? So Noor Anat Khan is another one that I think is really important. And then my last two are women who fought for equality in Britain. Because I think it's so interesting that we talked about Malala earlier, didn't we? And the fact that we want to break this narrative of the kind of this sort of oppressed South Asian woman. And the two women that I'm going to suggest were absolutely the opposite of that. So Sophia Dalip Singh, who was a suffragette, I will not talk about her because I know Roheema is going to talk about her, but she is one of my favourite people in history. So I would definitely suggest, all schools teach about the suffragettes. You've got to let your students know that not all the suffragettes were white. And again, there are plenty of photos of her, in the sashes, in selling the newspapers, etc. So why not teach your students about her? And the final person is a lady called Jaya-Ben Desai. So Jaya-Ben Desai she worked in a factory. She worked in a photo processing factory in Willesden, and this is in the 70s. So she's of the generation of our grandparents. So she worked in a factory, and she found out essentially that they were not being paid as much as other people were in the factory. They also were being treated really negatively by the bosses as well. They were sort of racial slurs were being told to them and things like that. And one day she basically just had enough and was like, you know what, I'm going to walk out. I just don't want to. I don't want to put up with this anymore. So she walked out. Other women walked out with her, and eventually there were up to 20,000 people outside the factory in solidarity with her. People would travel from all over the country to come and stand with her, which is incredible. And there's this great poster which I show the students, which has got a protester and it's got a placard, and it says, you can buy a Patel for £15. And I show that to the students, and they get really, because I'm a Patel, they get really like, what is this poster? And it was basically about the idea that factory, they knew that they could employ South Asian people to that factory at a lower cost than hiring Caucasian people, because they knew that South Asian people were desperate for jobs at that particular time. So she was known, Jaya-Ben Desai is known as the striker in a sari, which I think is great. The photos of her, please Google her, because she's literally in a sari, in a cardigan with her placard. She could be our grandma. And she is, and when I show the students the photo of her, I know that they're all looking at the photo thinking, she looks like my bar. Like she looks like somebody I know that we could just see walking around. And, this is recent history. This is 1976, and my grandparents lived near that particular area, and they'd never heard of her and never heard of that story. And I think so for me, it's local history, but it's also so recent, and she totally breaks the stereotype of the sort of meek, subservient South Asian woman. And it's so recent. So I think that if you're teaching students about protests for equality, etc., then Jaya-Ben Desai, the Gromwick strike, you've got to talk about her. The photos, of her protests are amazing. So those are my top five. There are so many other people, of course, and I know I've chosen a lot of women because we are a panel of women here. But yeah, those would be my 5 suggestions. But there are lots more. But yeah.
That was a great answer. I loved hearing about everyone. And what's really nice to hear? You didn't just pick like figures. You picked like groups of people. People that genuinely had like either like grassroots action or were like just behind the closed doors, still, fighting for sort of our rights, as South Asian people. And I think that's really great to see, and that you're so educated on it.
It relates to what I was before about the intersectional nature of South Asian history as well. Is that the last two people we talked about, Sophia Dalip Singh was a princess. She was descended from royalty, and then you've got Jaya-Ben Desai who worked in a factory. But these are 2 examples of South Asian women who lived in Britain who were fighting for equality. And it's, you know, there are so many stories out there, but you've just got to find them.